Thank you. It's so good to see all of you. I know most of you, I've worked with most of you, so it's good to see you all. As Megan said, my name is Katie Cavanaugh, and I had the privilege of working alongside Gladys as the Assistant Director of the Michigan Women's Center and Hall of Fame. And then I also served on the Board of Directors of MWSA for many more years. We were friends for the last 20 years, which is nothing compared to the friendships, the length of friendships many of you had with Gladys. But I valued my time with. Whoops, okay, there we go, I got muted. Gladys hired me right out of grad school. I was 25 and it was my first real job. I was quickly intimidated by her credentials and knowledge. And I'll be honest, she scared the bejesus out of me when I first met Gladys. But it quickly became clear that Gladys was one of the kindest and most thoughtful people I had ever met. Although she was closer to my grandparents' age, we easily became friends, and I learned more about women's history and women's studies from her than I did in all of my college and graduate classes. Gladys also taught me about working with people and getting a job done. She was one of the most tenacious and persistent people I knew. Those of you here, I think everybody knew Gladys in different ways and in different contexts, but I just wanted to tell you some more about her that maybe you didn't know. Dr. Gladys Eloise Beckwith, and I love that her middle name was Eloise, and I never knew that until fairly recently. Gladys was born in 1929, the year of the Great Crash and the start of the Depression, in Flint, to Arthur and Ina May. Like most families during the Depression, the May family lived frugally, never one to let adversity get her down. Gladys told this great story that as a kid trick-or-treating, one neighbor would offer the kids a bite of a pickle, not a whole pickle, one bite and of the same pickle. The kids would line up and take a bite and were perfectly content with their treat. Perhaps her persistence, strong work ethic, and compassion for others came from growing up in tough times. Gladys greatly valued education, a theme that we saw throughout her life. She graduated from Flint Central High School and Flint Junior College, and then earned a BA in English, an MA in English and Education, and a PhD in teacher education, all from Michigan State. Gladys educated thousands of students throughout her career. She taught at the elementary and secondary levels in public schools in Maine, Texas, and Michigan during the 1950s. She then taught at the university level at Baylor University in Texas before moving to Michigan State in 1965, where she stayed until her retirement in 1999. Teaching and interacting with young people may truly have been Gladys's first love. She was always excited to hear about what was happening on campuses and sharing ideas with students. In fact, out of all the many activities that we did at the center and in MWSA, her favorite activity was the annual academic conference held at colleges and universities around the state. It was while teaching at the Department of American Thought and Language at MSU that Gladys began to create courses focused on women writers, and women's history. Gladys and a handful of her colleagues then created the Women's Studies program at MSU in 1973. This is one of the earliest women's studies programs in the country. In fact, that same year, Gladys and one of her classes were featured in a US News and World Report article about the newly emerging field of women's studies. And Megan had that article in the picture showing on our screens earlier. Looking back at the creation of these classes, Gladys once said that what women's studies said was, there is a women's way of looking at the world, and women have contributed and they have shaped society, and we need to know just in what ways women have shaped it. So Gladys spent her life searching for how women shaped the world, but in the process, she shaped it herself. Along with some MSU colleagues, Gladys created the Michigan Women's Studies Association, MWSA, in 1973 to include community members in the women's movement and to encourage women's studies and feminist thought on academic campuses throughout the state. The idea of an association dedicated to discovering the lost and long forgotten history of women was so new that MWSA predates the National Women's Studies Association. Gladys served as the first president of the association, and with just a short interruption, she would hold that post until 2010. Gladys began to dream at this early stage of a place where the newly discovered information could be presented to the public. She also envisioned this place as a community meeting point where feminist ideas could flourish and be shared. Their goal was to influence education and to enrich the curriculum of public schools and colleges with the inclusion of information about women. So Gladys and Lansing City Councilwoman Lucille Beelan negotiated with the city of Lansing for $1 a year lease on the Cooley Hayes House in downtown Lansing. This beautiful historic home was once the governor's residence, but by then had fallen into disrepair and was scheduled to be demolished to make room for a parking lot. The city required that MWSA pay for the $250,000 renovation, which doesn't seem like much now, but in the late 70s, early 80s was quite a sum. So it was a huge fundraising task. The association had $1,200 to its name at that point. It took several years, but this became the Michigan Women's Historical Center and Hall of Fame. This facility finally opened on June 10th, 1987, which was the anniversary of the date in 1919 when Michigan ratified the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. So this was just a glorious day for members of MWSA, but it was especially meaningful to Gladys, who was a driving force behind its creation. Gladys served as the executive director of the Michigan Women's Historical Center and Hall of Fame. This position required not only an extensive knowledge of women's studies and various women's issues, but an ability to constantly be raising enough funds to keep the nonprofit going. While I hated making those phone calls, those fundraising phone calls, Gladys actually liked it. They gave her a chance to talk with people, something that she greatly enjoyed, and it gave her the chance to promote the center at the same time. During those years, Gladys could be found most days, including weekends and numerous evenings, at the center leading tours, talking to various groups, or working on the next of seemingly endless projects the small staff performed. She traveled throughout the state, speaking about women's history and about the center. Gladys served in the position of executive director from 1987, when we opened, until her retirement in 2008. Perhaps her most remarkable part of all of this is that Gladys did it completely without pay. It was all volunteer for her because it was something that she loved and was passionate about. But never wanted to sit still or feel she had done enough. Gladys also served as a trustee on the Lansing Public Schools Board of Education for 18 years. In many ways, she felt this was the most important work she did. She knew that when you reached kids, you could make a true difference in them and the world. She often encouraged others, especially women, to serve on their local school boards. In fact, I'm currently serving on a school board in part because of her. I had breakfast with Gladys shortly after the disastrous 2016 election. I was devastated and so angry and felt like everything was lost. But because she's Gladys, she snapped me out of it and told me to go out and do something about it. So I left that breakfast completely inspired and re-energized. She also told me to get on the school board, that's how you make change. So after that, I threw myself into state politics at the grassroots level. But also 2 years after that, I ran for and won my seat on a local school board. She was so proud of me for doing that. Our last phone conversation actually was about my reelection to the board. Gladys also served for many years on the state board for public community colleges. She very much believed in community college and saw the many advantages it had for many students. And many of those students were women. Gladys was always a community leader and deeply involved in various community and women's groups. I'm sure many of you know her in that capacity. She was a member of the Advisory Committee on Education for the Michigan Women's Commission, and she was active in the local and the state Democratic Party and in the ACLU. She was also an active member of AAUW, BPW, and Zonta. Gladys was a committed activist on behalf of women for most of her adult life. She was one of several women who refused to be denied seating in a male-only dining room in a Lansing restaurant. This restaurant later closed rather than open its whole facility to women. She was also actively involved in winning reproductive rights for women. One of her greatest stories she told was of being physically tossed out of a post office for gathering signatures in support to legal access to abortion. Gladys mentored countless younger women, encouraging and guiding them through academic, professional, and personal decisions. Gladys was always full of surprises. I only knew her when she was older, but I wish I had been with her in the early days as well. I've always suspected that Gladys hired me because I was young and strong and somebody had to do the heavy lifting at the center. She used to call me sturdy, which I never knew quite how to feel about. She also had a great sense of humor and she fully got my sarcasm. We laughed a lot in the office. I have to share one of my all-time favorite Gladys stories. This has some language. One time, and it must have been in the late 60s or the early 70s, and I wish I had asked her when, pinpoint the date. But on this occasion, Gladys had been called in to be an expert witness in the defense of a young woman who had been arrested for swearing at a police officer. Since she was a professor, Gladys was brought in to explain that the word fuck had a long history and was an acceptable word to use. She came in all dressed up in white gloves and a hat and proceeded to talk all about the word fuck. I loved it when she would tell me the story because it was so funny and because I never or very rarely heard her use any of that kind of language herself. So it was a bit shocking coming from her. Gladys was a true animal lover who supported and adopted pets from local shelters. She left behind her sweet Yorkie named Yoda and 2 cats. Gladys loved all animals, including even the raccoon that she live trapped and then drove to the forest to release. She said that he was a perfect gentleman as he rode through town in her backseat. She had many dogs over the years and she loved them all. In the last several years, Gladys purposely adopted senior dogs so they could live out their last years in a loving and comfortable home. When Gladys and I were working together, I heard countless stories of her beloved and troublesome beagle named Miranda, who was known to eat students' papers among her many naughty things. Gladys let me bring my miniature pinscher puppy, Jack, to the office, and he became our unofficial mascot and guard dog. He charmed us all by sleeping in my top desk drawer and by walking across the conference room table during our office meetings, giving everyone kisses. Jack would bark and bark as everybody came in first thing in the morning, and it was enough to make you crazy. But Gladys, because she, being the person that she was, would always say, "I hear the voice of an angel. Is that Jack?" Gladys was many things to many people. She was a loving wife and mother, a dreamer, a doer, a lifelong friend, a mentor, that lady who saved the big yellow house on Main Street, a trailblazer, a teacher, a colleague, an inspiration, and a hero. She saw the best in everyone and helped those in need. She was incredibly generous with her time and her resources. Gladys won many awards during her life, including being named 2004 Michiganian of the Year by the Detroit News, the Harriet Tubman Award from the Detroit Now, the Presidential Award for Outstanding Community Service from Michigan State University, and she was inducted into her own Michigan Women's Hall of Fame in 2012. Gladys was preceded in death by her parents and her husband, Dr. Gerald Beckwith, who shared her dreams. Jerry was by Gladys's side, encouraging her every step of the way as she strove to right the gender imbalances in society, academia, and history. She is survived by her beloved daughter, Christine, by her cousin, Dolores, and by many dear friends, including Tammy, Pam, and Tess. I know that Gladys and Tammy had a very special bond, and we are also thankful that Gladys had Tammy in her life who so lovingly cared for Gladys in those last years. I'm so happy so many of you could be here today over Zoom. I laugh when I imagine what Gladys would have to say about a virtual memorial over the internet. But I know that she would brush off all of the attention. I'm so sad to have lost my friend and my mentor. Thank you.